Good evening, and this is our third class for the RCIA for this year. And the class's topic is the very beginning of the Bible. The way I entitled it in your course outline is The Story Begins. Every book has an opening, and the Bible is not different from that. The very first book of the Bible is called the book of Genesis. And as I mentioned in last week's class, the Old Testament is there are all the books that are in your preface of the Bible put out under the type of literature. So the Pentateuch, this word means, the word penta, the first part of it, means 5, and chuk means books. So the first 5 books of the Bible have a particular title, the opening or the Pentateuch, the 5 books that begin it. Now, when I introduced you to the book of the Bible last week, and I gave you an introduction to the first pages 1 through, I think it ends around when you get to the preface. Yeah, it ends on page 46. So page 1 to 46 of your Bible, the first one, remember there are 2 page 1s. We will be starting today's lecture on the second page 1. But before that, there is another page 1. And in the preface, you have, as I brought out on page 7, all the books of the Bible. There are 46 books in the Old Testament and 27 books in the New Testament. That's how it's divided up. And those are listed on page 7. Now, I'd ask you to keep open for now page 6 in the Bible, the chapter 1, verse 1 of the book of Genesis. And I will teach you about chapter and verse in a minute. We talk about the Bible as 2 canons, 2 pieces of work. Canon spelled with 1 N. If it's 2 N's, it's up on the peak, and it's where they hid the cannons to shoot anybody coming into the harbor. The cannon that shoots is with 2 N's. The canon with 1 means collection. So, or it also means in Old Latin, law. The law has many other words, but canon, I am a canon lawyer, a lawyer of canonical ecclesiastical law. So it's different from civil law or any other form of law. But canon law is with 1 N. I love when people call me a CANNON lawyer. It means I'm a cannon shooting wildly lawyer, which may help get people. But this is how we do this. Now, the canon of the Old Testament is 46 books in the Catholic and the Orthodox editions of the Bible. Now, this is quite important. If you have been introduced to Protestantism, the Protestant Old Testament and the Hebrew Old Testament have only 39 books. And this is which is why I give you a Catholic edition of the Bible, because you will be missing some books in a Protestant or Hebrew Bible. Why? Because in the Catholic tradition and the Orthodox tradition, there are, I have to do the math, 7 apocryphal books. Apocryphal books. It just means books that there's a question mark not about when they were written, but should they be in the collection. In the Hebrew scriptures, they did not want these in there. You will also find out when we get to the New Testament, there are 4 Gospels. But in reality, more than 4 were written But when we made the canon of the New Testament, some of these Gospels were eliminated for many reasons. Primarily, they weren't the full Gospel, or they were written by authors we would not consider orthodox or people of writing the truth. And so the Old Testament editions are these books: Judith, Tobit, Baruch, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Ecclesiasticus, and the Wisdom of Solomon. Now, you don't have to worry about them. I just gave them as a title. And just to know, those 7 books, you would not find them in the King James Version of the Bible. They're not there. You will not find them in any Protestant edition of the Bible. And if you read Hebrew, if you do, God bless you. If you read Hebrew and you have a Hebrew Bible, you will not find those 7 books. They are only found in the Catholic and the Orthodox. Do you know what Orthodox is? Orthodox would be, these are national Catholic churches that split from the Catholic Church in the 11th century. And they are national because they are the Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Romanian Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox, this Orthodox, that Orthodox. They are very similar to the Catholic Church in everything except the Pope. That's the one thing that divides us. That and a small, I'm getting to your lectures in April, and a small phrase, filioque, a small Latin word. This filioque is why we split in the 11th century, in 1056, simply because of a misunderstanding of a translation. But as often happens in political life, when an argument breaks out, a diplomatic argument, a good one, I'll give an example. The French and the Australians and the Americans right now, like little children in a playpen. The Americans and Australians, without telling anybody, took away the French toys, submarines, worth a couple of $2 billion. The Australians needed that money. And the French had already turned their back on the Americans and gone, the French had ignored the Americans, and they made a treaty with Australia to construct these, was $8 billion worth of submarines. The Russians can sink that many in a week if they try. But then what happened? Everyone got like little kids in a sandlot. Why did they recalled the ambassador? The first time in the history of the United States, France, one of the first countries to recognize the United States as an independent country, recalled their ambassador. Now, for most of us, we don't even know what it means. Recalling your ambassador is a way of slapping someone in the face without pushing the nuclear button. It's one step removed. So they insult you by recalling their ambassador. It happens. And it happened between the United States and China. It happens all the time. Our ambassadors fly back and forth so often, we don't even talk about it. But now you had another case yesterday that came close to this. The woman head of Huawei, I can't pronounce the phone company, the electronic company, was finally released from Canadian prison. And 2 men in Canada who had been in prison since she was arrested were quietly sent back to Canada. But in the meantime, there was a diplomatic war going on between Canada and China over this woman who was about to be extradited to the United States. And I won't go into extradition because I might get in trouble. So we'll just leave it that this happens. And so here, when the Orthodox left the Catholic Church, it was over what, if you look at it, is a very tiny problem. What actually happened is about 5 centuries of the Pope in Rome overturning decisions of the patriarchs of the East, who are considered almost equal, but not quite. The Pope is called primus inter pares, first among equals. In the Orthodox, the patriarchs are all equal, and they actually operate more like a board of governors or a board of trustees. But the Pope always maintained a veto, and he started using it very injudiciously. Everything the Orthodox wanted, veto. And what happened is, and this is the result of not having cell phones in the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th century. The Orthodox bishop, the bishops of the East, they weren't called Orthodox, centered in Constantinople, would make a decision. It would take 3 months for that decision to get to Rome. Another 3 or 4 months to the Pope to write back and say, no way. And in the meantime, it's already been put into practice. And now he embarrasses the bishops withdrawing the permission. And this went on for 400, 500 years. And then this filioque controversy comes up. And the bishops in the East, the patriarchs of the East, and this would be Turkey, all of the Middle East, all of the Balkan states, and then going all the way up to Russia. Russia was already converted at 900, 970 or 975, something like that. 980. And so this is 1055, 78, I can't do math, years later, 2 or 3 decades later, more. And so what happens is that they have a mutual excommunication. I throw you out, and they went, we throw you out. So it's a mutual excommunication, withdrawing ambassadors. It's at that level. And what happened is that excommunication went from 1056 to 1968, when it was finally lifted. But all that, over almost 1,000 years, the mutual excommunication was there. We don't like you, we don't like you, we don't recognize, all this kind of stuff. So when I talk about the books that are accepted by the Catholic and Orthodox, all of us were one church for almost 1,000 years. The Bible was put together centuries before this. Around the 3rd century, the Bible as we know it today is already canonized. It is put into legal form with 46 books in the Old Testament and 27 books in the New Testament. Now, the word Bible comes from the Greek word, which is biblia. And biblia. Biblia. My Greek is off today. Biblia means books, a bibliotech. Bibliotech is the Greek word for library, where you keep your books. And the books of the Bible are a collection, which is why they are called a canon, and they are not a product of a single author. They are a collection. That's the big difference. Most books have one author. The Bible has dozens and dozens of authors, innumerable. The first printed Bible, this goes back to whatever you ever learned in history, was printed in 1453 by Gutenberg in Germany. That is the very first printed edition of the Bible. And before that, all the Bibles were kept in illuminated books, biblia, put together by monks. They were all handwritten. So imagine handwriting this with ink and pen, standing up. That's these things that I'm on were the original writing desks of monks. They were about this height, but just as much tilted up this way, so that they could put an entire parchment paper leaf on one piece of wood. And then they would have over here another stand, and they were copyists. They copied page after page. Imagine what their minds must have been. Just trying to survive 14 or 21 days of quarantine can drive you close to an insane asylum. Doing this for your life, day after day. And this is how mistakes were made in translation. Because a monk is going along writing, and he gets tired, or he falls asleep, or something, and he miswrites a word. And the copyist of his copy continues the miswriting. And this is why you have questions of syntax, or people will say, oh, that's not the real way it was written. Because these mistakes are made. We have the one that we tell, it's a very bad one, where they're talking about the word celebration. And the monk is trying to copy this in Latin, celebrat. And he makes a mistake and writes celibat. Don't get married, have no wife. And all of a sudden what's supposed to be a happy event becomes men are no longer allowed to marry, which for women was a happy event. But it's these kind of textual errors we tell jokes about. A simple letter changes the meaning, and in this one pretty badly. And so what happens is that up until the printed Bible in the 15th century, Bibles were kept in bibliotheques in monasteries. They were very precious. If you go to museums, you will see these remnants, the illustrated manuscripts, and they are quite beautiful. Because the monks were trying to make their life happy, they would begin the first letter like an I, and they hand-painted an illustrated manuscript with all kinds of flowers, vines, birds, animals in the I, and then the rest is normal. For those of you who are lawyers, the original law books for us in canon law, the earliest ones are by Gratian. Gratian is a 14th century lawyer, church lawyer, who lives in Genoa, which is where the university, no, I have the right city? Yeah, Genoa was the oldest legal university. The second oldest is the University of Paris. So the first law school came out of Italy, oddly. The second one, France. And they are only a few years apart in foundation. The original laws were put together over let's see, Gratian is 700 something, so 8th century. Beginning the 4th and 5th century, we have the Decretals. The Decretals are collections of Roman law that the church adopted because they became the civil authorities in Italy and other places by the 4th and 5th century. And so in order to build up a society, you need law. In order to have law, you go back to sources. The sources for Roman law go back to 1 or 2 centuries BC and go up until the 3rd century, 4th century AD. And the popes adopted certain laws, and they became the laws of the empire as it grew. So by the time of Charlemagne, in 800, we already have law, because the law schools had already been founded. And the law of Charlemagne became the law from these University of, what did I say Genoa? It's Bologna, I'm sorry. University of Bologna, not Genoa. Genoa never gave us anything. Bologna, just Genovese pesto. Bologna gave us bologna, the meat. But the University of Bologna is the oldest law school. And when the Decretals, we had to read them when we studied canon law. Thank God for iPads, because our professor would put up a page of an illuminated first page of the Decretals of Gratian. And typical of how you do law, you have the law in the center. And then you have the interpretations of the law written after a couple of decades and all as they refine what this law means. And I'll play with this again in the spring. But you will get handwriting, the big law, the law is in big letters, And then in tiny letters, they start writing out the margin, up here, turn over around, come down this side, and come under the bottom. So we would have to freeze our photo in our iPads and then turn it so we could read it, because this would be the part that was more essential, not the law, the interpretation of the law, the way that it was interpreted by the people who came after Gratian. It's very complex. By the time we get to the 9th century, the 8th and 9th century, with Gratian, these are now collected. And they stayed as a collection until 1917, when they were finally codified. So from 700 to 1917, our laws were these manuscripts with all these things written. And so when we study canon law, the desks you have now, in my law school, each of us has one desk, because you have to have so many books in front of you going pre-1917, 1917, and then the current law, which is 1979. No, 1983. I'm going to fail my, oh no, I already passed my boards. 1983. And now we have all the redactions by Pope Francis. Pope Francis has rewritten 2.5 books of the 7 books of law. And so we're all back to school again. Back to the Bible. That's all in a parentheses. But again, for you who are lawyers, you know this. Law changes. Law is never static. And it's the challenge of law that law is alive. But you get into the fight of all lawyers. And this comes into constitutional or national law. Is law static, or can it be changed? So we say the Constitution in the United States is our legal document. And for the British law, you have the Magna Carta that nobody has seen. British law is even more fun. But it's based on the interpretations of the Magna Carta that have been codified. We have the Constitution, which is partly the Magna Carta, and then partly what the Americans did with it over the centuries. And what happens is that you have those who feel the law cannot be changed. It is as it was written. And then you have those that say, well, you take the spirit of the law and go with it. And it's 2 schools of law. Both schools are right and both schools are wrong. And they argue constantly. So in my own country, liberal judges are considered those who see the law can be interpreted any way they want. They don't go back too much to sources. Conservative judges are those who say, this is the law, this is the interpretation. But they will not accept something that deviates from that, which is why the number of Supreme Court judges is always an odd number, so that you're going to have at the most a 5 and 4 vote and cry. And but that's how these things happen. Law is living, but there are certain parts of it that are immutable, unchangeable. So, and we'll get into this when we do moral theology. So, the first Bible was the Gutenberg Bible, but before that we had manuscripts. For all Jews and Christians, all or most of the Bible contain a source and record of God's self-communication, what we call his revelation, his revealing of himself to the world that God himself created. And for this reason, the Bible is important for both people of the Jewish faith and people of the Christian faith. The Bible is not primarily a body of truths, but it is a history of revelation of God over centuries, revealing himself to us, making himself known in and through nature, but also in and through special, what in Scripture we call mighty acts. When he saves Israel and its people from slavery, the most the biggest act of the beginning of the Bible after creation is the Exodus. The bringing of the Hebrew people out of slavery into freedom. The next big act comes centuries later, bringing the same Hebrew people out of exile in Babylonia, in Iraq, Iran, that area, and bringing them back to the Holy Land. So these are pivotal historic moments, things that we know historically happened. We know the Exodus happened. A word has been given. I have to say, a word has to be given about how to interpret the Bible. In coming to understand the literal sense of any passage in the Bible, you have to understand that this is not often clear in oral tradition. The Bible begins as oral tradition. Someone tells someone else what they heard. That's oral tradition. We used to have a game when I was growing up, a child's game at birthday parties. It was called telephone. Now you have to tell children what a telephone is. They only know this. We had these big machines. What you would do in telephone is you would line up everyone at the birthday party in chairs, going from left to right in a straight line. The first person is handed a message. They have to whisper the message to the second person, who then whispers the message to the third person, fourth, fifth, to the end. And the big joke is by the time you get down there, it has nothing to do what was originally said. Because each child, especially if they're young and quite entertaining, they add to the message, or they forget the message, and we start over again. And so this too happened in the Bible. It is oral tradition from one generation to the next. It is passed down. And so for that reason, you have to have other ways of understanding the Bible. Some are linguistic, the grammar used, or the logic of the words. Do these words actually make sense? Can you really read them and make some sense out of them, or are they illogical? What they wish to express in oral tradition does not follow rules of this. They're not meant to make sense. Oral tradition is supposed to pass on more of a big memory. In my family, on our birthday, we always had to suffer through the oral tradition of how we were born. And because at every birthday, that's the big thing. Before you even get a cake, my mother would tell the story where I came from and how. It became dull. But I know I started coming on a train. My mother miscounted the days of her labor, odd, she was a nurse, and decided to take a quick trip to Albany, though she was 8 3/4 months pregnant with moi. And she got on the train and got to about 100 kilometers out of New York, and I started coming out. So she had to get off at a station, and they put her on the next train back to New York, so I could be born in the hospital. I don't know how she got me there, because you would get to a station, then get to the subway, then get from New York, Manhattan to Queens, because I was born in Queens, in Jamaica, not the island, but the other one. But I was born by the doctor who was supposed to deliver me. Very heavy. I think I was an extra pound just from traveling. But my mother would always tell the story that I disrupted her trip. And of course, the other interpretation is my brother's birthday is 5 days the date, not the month, not the year. It's 2 years and 5 days. I was his birthday present, which he hates hearing. I loved reminding him I am the gift that keeps on giving. And I don't have to give him a birthday gift ever, because I am the gift. And you can't get any better than that, which is why he resents my birthday, his birthday and mine. He's never given me a gift. And I ask him, why not? And he said, well, you don't. And I repeat, but I am the gift. But what do you give me? I came after. You should be giving me something. I'm waiting. Well, I'll wait till my grave for that gift. So here, this is how interpretation works. And then as the story is, my mother tells the story of my other 5 brothers and sisters, we all laugh. My mother has now passed away. We still tell the stories, but we add to them. To the point where our nieces and nephews think we're really mentally deficient. The word in the Bible has to be given, you have to understand interpretation. Who is it written to? That's the first question. Who is going to receive this word? Who are they writing for? When is it written? The year, or at least the decade, is quite important because of their understanding of things. And then why are they writing the book? Which is why in each of the books of the Bible, there will be an introduction that answers those questions for you. Who, what, where, when, how are all in the italics preface to every chapter or every book of the Bible. Revelation, the word means to unveil, to uncover. And when we talk about divine revelation, God's self-revelation in the scripture, it is God pulling back a veil so that human nature can understand divine nature. In many religions, the divine is almost unmentionable. In Islam, you can't mention it. In Hebrew, I mentioned last week, you don't say the word for God. It's considered too sacred to even pronounce. For us, we consider God intervening in history, that a history that continues to move forward. History is lineal. It's time. It begins and it moves to an end. But events in history are cyclical, like the seasons. They go around and around. Birth, maturity, death. Birth, maturity, death. That's cyclical time. But it moves forward. Divine knowledge is how we come to know God generation after generation. How did they understand God? And this is why the book of Genesis is so important. It is how our earliest ancestors understood how we got here. Because that's if you have, as I've said in the last class, if you have little children, 2-3 years old, who have now learned to ask questions, you realize an answer is never enough. They will keep going, but why? But why? But why? Earlier today, I was helping someone. I'm tutoring through his TEFL exams. What is it? Whatever, I don't know what it is, but the TEFL. And he had hit something today he could not understand, the rhetorical question. And he had no idea. He just couldn't, from his language, fathom what it is a rhetorical question. And I said, did your mother or father ever say something to you such as, what, do you want me to drop dead? Or some expression like that. Your parents aren't expecting you to say yes. It's a rhetorical question. You don't answer it. It's when we preach. Most of our preaching, if we have a question, it's rhetorical. We don't want people to stand up and shout an answer, amen. I don't know. They're not meant to be answered. A rhetorical question is, do you understand? And I keep going, whether you do or not. That's a rhetorical question. In English, it is used mostly in speech, but it can also be used in writing. But in writing, it's very difficult. You have to understand. Always ask yourself this. When you see the question mark, are they expecting an answer? And that answers whether it's rhetorical or not. Now, in the Bible, that's another thing you have to understand. The next is something called textual criticism. Textual criticism is something you don't have to know, we had to know to study the Bible, where you have to see how the phrases are put together. because in the Bible they are constantly picking something from the Old Testament and dropping it in the New Testament. It's not considered plagiarism, but it is rather a way of showing development. And again, what I mentioned before, the errors in copying texts. Textual criticism helps them make their way through that. And we're also dealing with ancient texts that have a problem with the gloss, G-L-O-S-S. So, the gloss I've already explained. This is Gratian's law. If I had been better prepared, I would have brought it in. This is Gratian's law. It's very basic. It's at the center of the paper. Then the gloss. The textual redaction, this is what he meant to say. The second gloss. The third gloss. The fourth gloss. And then it goes like off the page. The gloss is where you actually see the interpretation, but it's not the actual text. So you have to go back to what did Gratian write and what did the gloss interpreters put into the text. And this happened in the Bible, in the Old Testament and the New Testament. As the monks were writing, occasionally they'd get carried away and start writing gloss around the sides. And you see this, sometimes they would put hidden messages and even off-color pictures in the beautiful illustrated paintings they did. They were, some of them went a little crazy, but what a biblical scholar does is they have to pull that out and get back to what the origin is. The beginning of divine relation comes after the fall. Now, what the fall is, we will read in the book of Genesis, is where we see the fall. The rupture between God and man. The rupture of fidelity caused by man's disobeying God's original precepts. And so this leads to the expulsion and the whole beginning of the book of Exodus. So I'm going to start with that. Now, I'd ask you to open, again, I'll just begin. The first 5 books, the Pentateuch, the author, even though it's not really him, these are the Mosaic books, the books written by Moses. They really aren't, because Deuteronomy comes long after Moses was dead. But they are attributed to his style. So here, the Pentateuch are from Moses, or called the, I'm writing this word, the Mosaic. 8, that's 8. Mosaic. No, anyway, not mosaic as in tiles, but this is Mosaic law. And if you open to page 6 and 7, you have this beautiful illustration, which I talk about a lot in my homilies in church every now and then, if people know this. This is the original concept of how we were created. This is on pages 6 and 7 in the book of book of Genesis. And so I want you to keep this page open as I begin to explain. You're going to see what this looks like. Basically, it looks like a herd of elephant legs on the bottom. And then you have here, because you have the text in front of you, you have what is called the columns of the earth. They didn't know much about gravity, but they did know that we don't go up into the air. We're grounded. And how do they explain that ground? What's holding the ground up? All they knew is what held them up, which is their legs. What held animals up? Their legs. And so what they do is they create this mass, the earth, with the mountains and the rivers and the seas, all being held up by these columns of earth. Then you have the oceans on the extremes, these bodies of water. And then they put up this firmament, like an arc, because they see how the sun travels from east to west in the sky. And they also know that when the sun goes down, the moon appears. And then at night, they have these lights, bright lights, the stars. They can see them because they don't have city lights. So there comes, and then they know, what else comes down from the sky? Rain. That was a rhetorical question. What else comes down? Rain. Rain comes down from the sky. So how do you explain that? And they have a wonderful thing. They have these floodgates, little doors up there, and every now and then someone pulls a lever and the water comes down. And then they close the lever and the water stops, because that's what rain is. It stops and goes. Now, they are writing this a long time before we knew anything about how we got here by science. So we begin with the Bible with the first book, the book of Genesis, which opens with the history of creation. You see the title, Preamble, The Creation of the World, chapter 1, verse 1. And as all good books, it starts in the beginning, or modernized, once upon a time. Okay? Once upon a time in old language would have been in the beginning. In principio, and it becomes in the beginning is a phrase that starts a history. This is how we got here. And so they're going to do this very long, beautiful passage, which is always read on Holy Saturday night at the vigil where people are baptized. This is the very first reading. How did we get here? And it is this idea of God creating the heavens and the earth in 6 days and resting on the seventh day. And so I will let you read this on your own, but this is the story. And you will notice if you get to page 7, you have, thus the heavens and the earth and all their array were completed. And on the seventh day, God completed the work he had been doing. He rested on the seventh day, and from all the work he had undertaken. The seventh day. Now, here, one thing that the Jewish people gave to the world was the 7-day week. Up until the Hebrews' story of creation, all humanity followed a monthly cycle of 28, 29 roughly days. We followed the cycle of the moon for time. And so time in the most primordial cultures was what divided, time was divided by the moon cycles. And so up until the Hebrews, everything was on a monthly cycle of 12. Because they were able to at least know the sun moved in the sky and then came back 12 months later to where it was. This is the tilting of the hemispheres. Again, we're going into Earth history. They didn't know how to explain it, but because over years of witnessing it, they understood this 12-month cycle, 12 time divided by 2830, gives you their time cycle of 1 year. So they knew that the sun takes a year to go around this cycle. And they divide that up by moons, 12 full moons. And that gives them time. But it was the Hebrews who divided the month into four cycles of 7 days. They were the ones that gave us a day off. And they put it into creation, that the day off for them is a divine law. Human beings should be given a day to rest, but not just humans. Humans animals, slaves, everyone gets a day off. And they put this into the Mosaic law, and this is found in the story of Genesis and the creation of the world in 6 days plus 1. Now, you'll see here too, they have a logical order of how creation begins. You begin going back to page 6. Now, I have to give you this chapter verse. J-T-E-R verse. Every book in the Bible is divided by chapter and verse. Chapter and verse comes from the 15th century when we actually printed the Bible. Before, there was no such thing. But it gave those printing a way of dividing this long parchment into smaller readable parts. So the chapter and the verse, every book of the Bible is divided now into chapters and verses. The chapter is a collection that can be put together as a unified whole, and the verses are not the individual sentences, but phrases. A verse can be 3-4 lines, it can be a half a line. It depends on how you would read it, and they give you the natural break by the verses. So you don't connect phrases that don't belong together. So chapter and verse, whenever I'm referring to something, I will say chapter 1, verse. If you look at your Bible on page 6, it will have chapter 1, and then you see the story of creation. That little number 1, you can barely see it. That's verse. You are also going to see even tinier numbers and letters, and they go down to the footnotes. The footnotes are not part of the Bible. They help you understand what you are reading. They were added by the editors. So the reason I use this Bible is the footnotes are extremely helpful. Other times I would say, if it's too small, don't read it. These are more for biblical scholars. They understand, for instance, the first, again, I'm not going to be off camera for this so you can see me. In each section, the first set of really minuscule italics numbers are going to tell you where this particular verse, phrase, word is found in other places in the Bible. What I had said earlier, how in the course of history, people would take a phrase from the Old Testament and drop it into the New Testament. Even before they had computers, they knew how to do this. And so you will have here these, they will be referring to a small, footnote. It will be a little letter, not a number, because that's verses. And that will lead you down to the bottom. These are not critically important for you, but they do help you understand the richness of the verse that you're reading. That this is something that has taken a long time to put together. Now, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, are one collection, the Pentateuch, the 5 books. Genesis opens with the history of creation and the beginning of human society. Adam and Eve have 2 sons, Cain and Abel. And we'll go through this part by part. And then Cain kills Abel, and then you have the development of human society. Then you have God's choice of patriarchs, and you have other names in the book of Exodus that are very important. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Joseph, the last name. So just remember my name, and that's the end of Genesis. The story of Joseph closes Genesis. Why? By the time you have Joseph, the Jewish people have migrated from Ur, which I showed you last week, way off camera, way in the east. They got to Egypt. And it took them hundreds of years to get there. And that ends Genesis. Exodus begins now with the Jewish people in Egypt, but slaves, under Moses. And that begins the second book, the book of Exodus, which tells the story of how God chose Moses. God intervenes in history. He chooses someone to deliver Israel from the slavery and lead them to the new covenant, to the Holy Land, or the Promised Land. And the book closes with a detailed description of this tent that they carry through the desert to get to the Promised Land, where they keep the tablets of the Ten Commandments. So that's that. If you want to see a quick version, go on, I don't know, Netflix, whatever, and find the Ten Commandments, the movie. It is kind of rough to watch now, but that tells you the whole thing in about 2 hours instead of reading the whole book. But I would recommend reading the book. At least you'll find out who these people are. The third book is Leviticus, the book of laws. What happens is, as a people are created, as society is created, human nature demands law to control the community. Law is not meant to enslave, but to help people live in peace. That's the whole purpose of law. It is not a negative, it's a positive. Law helps to codify how we relate to each other, how not to do certain things because they get other people upset, how to chew food, that's a law. Wearing masks, well, I don't. Masks are crazy. Now you don't see any of these things we do. But we have, we all pick up customs, and custom becomes law in many times. One of the precepts of canon law is custom that lasts so many generations automatically becomes law if it is not harmful to the community. Marriage. The whole idea of marriage is custom. We didn't codify marriage until basically the 7th or 8th century. But it was created in the church legally to protect women, because men being men, they'd say, "Oh, I love you. I want to stay with you. I'll be with you always. Let's get married." And then about 6 months later, somebody better looking passes by and you're already pregnant, and he disappears and you're left with the baby. It didn't just happen in the 20th century and the 21st century. It happened from the time of Adam and Eve. They didn't do this. So what happened is the church, to protect women, instituted the state of marriage. Society did. Roman law did, to protect women from being left with children and no way of protection. Because most law, sadly, protects men's rights, not women's rights, at least until a more modern era. But marriage law was meant to protect women, and it gave the right to go after the guy and drag him back. And so this again how law develops. So the laws of Leviticus, if you read Leviticus, it is a law book. This is how you eat. This is what we consider pure food. This is what we consider haram, food we should not eat. The great one, pork, one of my favorite meats. I would never have made it as a Hebrew, because they're not allowed to eat it. The reason was, pork, if you know much about animal bacteria, pork is the hardest meat to kill and then clean, because there's blood everywhere. And so many people, there was a universal ban on pork going back to this time in history, because people would kill pigs, eat it, and get sick. Therefore, let's not eat it and we don't get sick. When I lived in Africa, many of the people there would not eat pork, which was fine with me when we had it because I didn't have to share. But I would never have survived without it. And I told the story, I think, in my last class. In Tanzania, we have a very strong Islamic population. For Muslims, pork is haram. We do not eat it. And we had a woman who was a senior member of the government, highly educated, a Muslim. Her English was not so good. She went to Germany. She was the minister of, I think, it was one of these new ministries we had invented before. Anyway, whatever she wasn't the minister of education, thank God. She went to Germany. We were trading partners with Germany. And she was at a banquet. Now, for the Tanzanians, the word pig is nguruwe. And nguruwe is haram. You don't eat it. And the most basic translation is nguruwe equals pig. The only word in English they use, pig. So she's at a banquet table. They bring out all this food, and Germans love pork in all different ways. Pork, roast pork, sausages, pork this, pork that, everything. They eat the pig from head to tail and everything in between. Pork knuckle, and they bring out this big roast pork. And if you ever have had roast pork, it is very aromatic. It smells wonderful. And you want to die. Well, here, charju. How did I mispronounce it? But one of the favorite things here. Charju, yeah. Which is pork. Don't put it in front of a Muslim friend because they can't eat it. Now, she sat down. She's smelling this food. Pork makes you salivate. It's that kind of a food. She's salivating. And all of a sudden, her Muslim background is there. So she turns to someone, a German, and says, "Is this pig?" And he goes, "No, it's pork." And she goes, "Oh!" And she eats it. And she goes back to Tanzania, and she's giving a talk in front of all these educated women, university graduates, and she's saying the Germans are amazing. They can take something called pork, and it's not pig, but it tastes like it. And she was so powerful, no one laughed. They would be hung. She led a coup against the president, she was hung. But anyway, her name was Bibi Titi, very famous, not knowing pork equals pig or pig equals pork. And she broke the law. She ate what was condemned. Okay, but for them, it is a condemned meat. Why? Because people used to get sick. If you as a child ever ate something and you got violently ill, your body is telling you don't do it twice. The first time I ever got on a plane, at 9 years old, I got violently ill. It took me years to get back on a plane, till I was 17, because every time I got on a plane, I started getting sick, because my first plane ride made me sick. This is how we work, how we operate. I lived with a priest. The first time he ever had an egg, he got violently ill. And he never ate cakes because eggs are in cakes. And I lived with him for 7-8 years. We couldn't have eggs at breakfast unless he was not there because he can't eat them. Then he became a bishop and eventually a cardinal. Now he eats eggs all the time. Same with beer. When we were teachers together, we could have one beer every week on Sunday night at 7 o'clock. And that was it. Otherwise, we were very abstemious. But we were teachers. Teaching demands alcohol. Sorry on the camera. Just to survive going in day after day to see students. Major seminarians are as difficult as kindergarten. And they acted. And one day, we had to get rid of one of our faculty. He had had a nervous breakdown, was driving us all crazy. And I had to take the rector with me, this priest, and we had to put the sick priest on the Swiss Air flight out of Dar es Salaam at 7 o'clock in the morning to Geneva. And our mass began at 7. So we took him to the airport at 5:30, dropped him, ran back, and we're standing on the porch of the chapel watching Swiss Air take off, so we know he's on it. And the rector said, as soon as Mass is over, beers. We didn't have first period because we couldn't. We were all in the faculty house, which was way far from the students, drinking. It was one of my happiest days. That priest is still alive. He's in my community, but not with me anymore. Turn to page 7, the next page. You're going to have this map of Ur and how the Israelites get from point A to B. The map doesn't seem to have a page number, so because it's on the back of the other map. And you'll have Ur is over here, the very bottom of Iran. Iraq. That's right. I don't know. I get it. They're all one big country to me. The other one is Persia. Yes. And so what happens is that this is where traditionally Abraham is from Ur. So Abraham, I'm jumping from Adam and Eve to Abraham. It's a jump of about 1,000 years. Abraham is from there, and where you have Ur, I'm going upside down again here, you see two lines going through it. Those are the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. The cradle of civilization for many anthropologists, together with the Serengeti is the other. The Serengeti is in Tanzania where I live. Also considered the cradle of civilization because the oldest remnants of the human skeleton were found there in the Rift Valley. But here is where we have written oral history and written history coming from Ur. And so the map there traces the direction that the Israelites traveled to get all the way over eventually to the Red Sea and then crossing over into Egypt. Now, they cut it off before they crossed over because that is the very end of the book of Genesis. The next thing you're going to see, the fourth book is Numbers, which is more laws and regulations added. Because law comes to a point where as people live more and more together, there are more laws needed. If you live by yourself out in the middle of nowhere, then you have a wife. The first thing you do is you start having house laws, do's and don'ts. I teach this to people in my marriage course. When a couple start living together, it almost can lead to war, which is why you have to have law. Who's going to do the dishes? Who's going to clean the bathroom? Who's going to make the meals? Who's going to clean up after the meals? Who's going to do the laundry? Who's going to, and for many couples, this is almost like negotiating a very important contract, especially if both of them, husband and wife, are working. Who can cook? Because you have cultural norms that only one person should do the cooking and one person does the hunting. In the ancient law, men hunted, women cooked. But then you have, history develops. But every time two humans live it together, you need laws. And even small things. How you sit at a table, what you put on a table, how you brush your teeth, how you do your hair, whatever, how you dress. These are all laws. And so the book of Numbers is a second book of law. And finally, the final book, Deuteronomy, or second law, deutero means two, and onomy is another word for law. The second law is composed as a reflection on Leviticus and Numbers, and it's much more thought out, and it's written by a totally different author. So in the scripture in the Old Testament, when you're reading it, there are people from the Deuteronomic period who rewrote whole books of the Old Testament. And you have to know which is which. You don't have to know, I'll tell you. I'll save you the headache. But if I say something is written by a Deuteronomist over a Yahwist, Yahwist is the most ancient tradition. Deuteronomist is the most modern. And it would be in some of the books go one way or the other. Enough of that. Now let's get to the story. You have all of chapter 1 of Genesis talks about the creation of the world in 7 days. Then it goes back to the Garden of Eden. Because when man was created, where did God put him? And they talk about this beautiful, palatial, comfortable, everything is there garden, where everything is good. This is the story of the heavens and the earth and their creation. And so the story of the Garden of Eden is a second creation story. You have the long one, chapter 1, chapter 2, a shorter one, but more important, because in chapter 2, God creates man. In chapter 1, it's there on the sixth day, but it's not, God creates, he creates mankind in his own image. Yes, look back to page 7, because I will repeat this thousands of times. Verse 27. Verse 27, in the middle of the first column on page 7, first column, the middle before it goes into the italics. God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. That's it. There is no X, B, G by D, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, X, asterisk. There is no such thing. God created two genders, male and female. It is built into your DNA. I don't care what everyone else says. They're wrong. Anyone who is a scientist knows you cannot change DNA. It is unique. You can do all the mutilated surgery you want, with making you man to woman and woman to man. Sorry. That little gene that defines man, male or female, cannot be surgically removed, nor can it be implanted. Everything else is the wonders of cosmetic surgery. Now, I say this because also it makes very clear man and woman are equal. He created them, man and woman. He doesn't say man is better. It's just the style of writing. God created humankind, mankind, this way, in his image. And he creates them, male and female. He created them. That is a very important phrase. In the very first chapter, God sets out humanity and gender. Notice there's no neuter. That's in the other parts. Neuter is basically, the gender of neuter is things that man creates, or human nature creates. Table is neuter. This is neuter. The cell phone. Anything that human nature can create is neuter. Anything that is created in nature, birds, animals, trees, rivers, anything that is alive is not neuter. So, and this is why when you get into languages that have gender, male and female and neuter in English, other languages just male and female, they will have an article that tells you if this, the ocean, l'oceano, in Italian it's masculine. But lago, a lake, it ends in an O, that's masculine. A river, riviera, is A, that's a female. O means masculine, A means feminine. And then the plural, I masculine, E feminine. But then there are, like English, 25,000 exceptions. In English, we are much more complex. Latin, all the Romance languages delineate gender. So Latin, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese. You have these articles that tell you the word is masculine or feminine. The hardest part I had learning French and then Italian was memorizing the article. You can always think anything that ends in Italian in O is masculine. So this, mono, in plural, it's feminine. It is one of the hardest concepts to understand. What article do you use for a hand? Hands. So you have the feminine, delle mani, the hands. But this is mono. Again, every language has exceptions. Look at how confusing his and her is if you don't have them in your own language. And I tell these jokes with the other judges I have. I'm the only natural English speaker judge. And in marriage cases, you have a him and a her in every case. Otherwise, we wouldn't accept it. And every case, you will have the person, the petitioner, and then we have the respondent. One is going to be masculine, one will be feminine. Who starts the case is the petitioner. Who responds to the case, the other party is, is the respondent. And I will be reading a judgment because I'm often the assessor judge to correct the judgment before it goes to the final phase. And all of a sudden, she becomes he. And in a marriage case, this is critical. When all of a sudden she who started the case has now become he, and I'm going back in the testimony, did she have an operation? Because she was she, now she's he. And it's simply the translator translating from Cantonese to English just messed up. So I have to go through and correct, and again, you know by reading back the testimony who said what about whom. Otherwise, and because if anyone ever comes to look at our files, that's what an assessor judge does. I make sure they're presentable, that somebody from outside can actually read them. Thank God we only write in English here. If you're working at the higher up level, you write in Latin, which is more complicated. So here, this is one of the things to know. Now, going into chapter 2, the reason chapter 2 is different is you have an explanation of why God created man and woman. And so you have this long explanation. They will talk about the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, they'll talk about all this other stuff, and they place the Garden of Eden between the Tigris and Euphrates. So they place it in a very fertile, beautiful area where the temperature is temperate and everything is wonderful. You have water, you have the sky, you have animals, you have plants, and the sea is nearby. And then he creates man, Adam, the first. And then he creates man from Adam. And this is the creation story. Why? Because, and it's trying to explain why are men attracted to women and women attracted to men. It's a very simple question. How do you explain this? How do you tell your children? So here's a very good example. The man was lonely. It's interesting, the man is lonely, the woman wasn't. But the man is lonely. And so we begin with lonely Adam, moping around, looking at everything he has, but being lonely. And then God says, okay, I will create a partner for you. I will create the perfect partner. And I tell this joke, which is very bad, that God went to see Adam. And he said, I'm going to create the most wonderful partner you will ever want. This person will wait on you. They will cook for you. They will clean everything up after you. They will be so obedient and loyal to you, but it's going to cost you an arm and a leg. That famous English phrase for expensive. And Adam is listening to all this, and then he turns to God and says, what will I get if I only give you a rib? It's a terrible, I tell that joke occasionally at weddings and it ends the wedding ceremony. But it's a story, Adam was given all this, but he wanted to bargain for something less. And then this is how we say, well, this is what you get. You only wanted to have the rib. You do know in anatomy, men have a part of their rib is missing from the very beginning. And it's called the Adam's rib. Women don't have it. There are two things that make us divided. Go get a chest x-ray and go check. No, don't. It's expensive. This. The Adam's apple. Men have it. Ladies, thank God you don't. And of course, God punishes us. We have to shave over it, which is like cutting your throat every morning. Ladies can just laugh. Make sure the razor is always sharp. Make him suffer. But when I was an orderly, this was the hardest thing to shave when we were taking care of patients, because we used straight razors. And when a man sees someone coming at him with a straight razor, even the best barbers use straight razors, but men close their eyes at that point. They don't stay there because you're waiting for that, and then the blood spurting everywhere. What is that? What was that famous musical? Sweeney Todd. The barber of Fleet Street or whatever. Here, these are differences. When a man decides, like Bruce Jenner wants to become whatever he became, he had to have this shaved down, which is, to me, is like, ooh, why go that far? Just wear turtlenecks. No one knows. But these are differences. There are differences, slight ones. So God will say, this one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one has been taken. The word in Hebrew is taken from man, taken from Adam. And so that's how it comes there. And then it ends with the explanation of marriage. That is why a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and the two of them become one body. So it explains how we now make children, all in one sentence. There's an Italian movie some years ago called Moonstruck with Cher, before she went crazy. And she got, I think, an Academy Award. Her acting was spectacular. And there's an elderly Italian couple watching a moonrise from their bedroom. And at one point, the wife turns to her husband. They've been married about 40 or 50 years. And she says to her husband, "Why do men, even when they're happily married, chase other women?" And it's one of the funniest but very philosophical scenes in the movie. He says, "Maria, when God created you, he took part of my rib. And all men spend their life trying to get that part back. And they just go from woman to woman till they find it." And we were like, okay, if that works. Don't use it in divorce law. But it's how they explain it. It doesn't explain it at all. Then chapter 3. And then the last phrase, the man and the woman were both naked and they felt no shame. How do you explain why people are embarrassed to be naked in front of other people? It is a cultural norm. People are not comfortable. So how do you explain putting things over you? They do it in one sentence. First, they say they felt no shame. Then you have the fall, the expulsion from Eden, and their eyes were opened, and they're like, ooh, ooh. And then they started covering themselves. Again, another little story from my past. We were 6 children, boys and girls. Bath time became a pain in the neck for my mother. So up until a certain age, we had co-ed bathtub. Everybody in the bathtub till you realize, oh wait, she's missing something or he has something, then you're separated. You have the natural separation. They don't tell you why, but you no longer bathe with your brothers and sisters. So I was out of the bathtub very quickly, my older brother and I. But it's a natural way for parents to explain things. You don't have to explain. You just get expelled from the bathtub. You have to wash later. And so here, what happens? Adam, the other thing is they have to talk about how this rupture with God takes place. God gives them everything. And then he says, but there is one tree in the garden, and I tell you not to eat from that tree. You have everything else. And along comes Satan in the image of a snake, because everyone hates snakes, mostly. And the snake tempts Eve, saying God is doing this because he doesn't want you to have as much knowledge as he does. It's called the tree of the knowledge of life. So Eve plucks the fruit. It's not an apple. And nowhere here does it say it's an apple. It says fruit. But every painting, it's an apple. I don't know why. Maybe they didn't like apples. Or apples sometimes have worms. Anyway, she gives the apple to Adam. Adam takes a bite. Notice, Eve doesn't take a bite yet. She gives it first to Adam. He bites it, his eyes are open. She takes a bite, her eyes are open, and they run to the bushes and they create the first clothing, which are leaves here and there. And so you have the creation of this, and then the expulsion. You broke the law. How does God know they did? They did this. He goes into the garden, and he's going, Adam, Eve, where are you? I don't see you. They're hiding because they're naked. They realize they're naked, and they're hiding themselves. So God knows they ate from the tree of life, and they ate the forbidden fruit. They broke God's law, and they broke their relationship with God. And so now they come on page 10, verse 17, halfway down. Now you're going to explain, why do women give, when they have childbirth, why is it painful? Why can't the baby just appear? You order it online and it comes in the mail. God says this, and why do men have to work until they sweat? It's all answered in 2 or 3 phrases. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat its yield all the days of your life. No longer will it be free. Thorns and thistles it shall bear for you, and you shall eat the grass of the field. By the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread, until you return to the ground from which you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So this explains labor. Now go all the way up to the very top of that column. God turns to Eve first, and he says, I will intensify your toil in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Yet your urge shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. This is a very hard phrase because modern, the way we treat each other, man and woman, this is a very negative thing for women. But it's in their mind, again, 4,000, 3,500 years before modern history. This is how they explain why is childbirth painful, and yet why, knowing it's painful, why do people get pregnant? Because if you know, again, if you put your hand in fire, you don't do it a second time. If you get pregnant and have a child and it's painful, why would you do it a second time? This answers the question. Not a nice way of answering it, but it's their way of trying to explain the world to their own understanding of human nature. They don't know how these things work, but they come close to it. And that's why it's important to read this. And at the end of this chapter, Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden. And now we move on to chapter 4, and this will be the story of Cain and Abel. The story of Cain and Abel is there to explain, why do people commit major crimes? And there are a number of major crimes here. First of all, it is 2 brothers, Cain and Abel. One is a shepherd, the other is a farmer. In ancient societies, there was always tension between farmers and shepherds. Always. The development of the United States, the whole movement out of the East Coast west was this constant fight between cowboys and farmers. We have whole musical theaters about it. Because why? The cowboys migrate, the shepherds migrate, the farmers are stationary. And there was always a tension between the 2 groups. People who roam and people who settle. And here you have, God in a way makes a judgment against the shepherds and for the farmers. The older brother is a shepherd, a herder. The younger brother has a little farm. And they get, what happens? Jealousy. Where does jealousy come from in human nature? And they develop this story of offering gifts to God, and God being favorable to one and not favorable to the other. Isn't that how jealousy begins? When you begin to feel someone is against you, or something has been taken from you. And so what happens? Cain gets angry with his own brother and kills him. The crime of fratricide, killing your brother. And so, how to explain why would someone kill someone else? They have this story. And not only kill an enemy, you're killing your brother, a blood relative, which is a much higher, any kind of killing of your mother, your father, husband, wife, son, brother, sister, close family is considered a higher level of murder than murdering someone you hardly know. This is murdering someone you know. And so this is all explained in this story of Cain and Abel. Very short story. And then Cain is given a mark, whatever the mark was. God marks him. And then for the rest of his life, everyone knows he committed this sin. We have in English the expression, the Mark of Cain. And it just means as though something you did, people can almost read it on your forehead. So, how were slaves marked in ancient society? They were branded on the head. How were the Roman soldiers always shown? When you became a Roman soldier, you were branded so that you could not go AWOL unless you totally covered your head. Because the mark of the Roman soldier was burned onto the forehead. You belong to the emperor. A slave had a burn mark also, because why? A burn leaves a scar. A scar cannot be removed. And so the mark became a way in human nature of marking property. You brand animals to show which are yours. Sheep, goats, cattle, whatever. Don't try to ever brand a pig. They don't stick, they run quickly. It's easier with cows, sheep. Sheep are dumb anyway. Goats, you can do that. But again, why do you brand? Brand is a sign of ownership. So I'll end with that today. Thank you very much. Let me turn off the camera. That's full.